Chapter 21. Cole drove himself hard after Edwin and Garvey left, staying busy every waking minute of each day. If he had to spend a whole year on this island, he had no intention of living like an animal. Each morning he soaked in the pool and carried the ancestor rock. Afternoons he worked improving camp. At night he slept like the dead. By the time Edwin visited next, Cole had built a table, a chair, and a bed frame for an old foam mattress that was part of his supplies. He made the furniture from driftwood, nails, and scraps left over from the cabin. He also started collecting armloads of firewood, cutting and splitting the wood with a small hand-sawn hatchet, and stacking it in a straight pile against the cabin. Over the top he placed strips of leftover plywood and a tarp. For a bathroom, he dug a big hole up among the trees. When the hole filled, he would cover it with dirt and dig a new one. He didn't look forward to using it in the winter. Edwin said little during his first visit. He eyed the pile of firewood and furniture with approval. Garvey flew back to Minneapolis, he said as he crawled into his skiff to leave. He was plenty worried about you. If you talk to him, Cole said, tell him thanks again for the knife. I'll carve something special. What? Cole shrugged. I don't know yet. Edwin started the motor, backed away from the shore, and waved goodbye. Cole watched the boat again until it blinked from sight. This time he didn't feel the desperate loneliness and fear of 4 days earlier. It would not be easy, but he knew now that he could survive. Instead of returning to the cabin, he headed around the shoreline to hike and think. Wandering along the grassy flats above shoreline a mile from camp, he came upon a huge driftwood log. The weathered white log had been worn smooth and was straight as a telephone pole. It looked to be well over 20 feet long and almost 2 feet in diameter. Cole tried to imagine what kind of storm could wash such a log up a dozen feet above the high tide mark. He remembered all too well one storm that could have done it. As he examined the huge log, an idea came to him. Back in Drake, there had been a whole field filled with totem poles. Most had carvings of animals, the same as the totem designs on the atoll. Cole didn't know what the figures meant, but he wondered if he could carve his own totem. Still, he studied the log. There was something else this log would work for. The thought frightened him, and he pushed it out of his head. He would carve a totem, but how could he move the huge piece of wood? Cole returned to camp and brought back 2 lengths of rope. He tied one to each end of the log. By tugging on one at a time, he rolled the log down over the rocks until it slid into the water. When he saw how high the log floated in the water, his mind again toyed with the idea that had scared him earlier. This log would make a great dugout canoe. It would make the perfect escape. With the rope, Cole pulled the floating log slowly along the shoreline back to camp, using the last 2 hours of daylight to push, pull, and wrestle it up over the rocks, and until it rested near the fire. By the time he finished, it was totally dark. Cole lit the lantern inside the cabin and made a jelly sandwich. He went to the doorway and started out at the big log. Finally, he slammed the door and crawled into bed. For several hours he lay awake. Even after dozing off, his sleep was troubled. When dawn finally came, he felt groggy and rolled over for more sleep. It wouldn't hurt to skip the pond just one morning. The sun was high above the horizon when he finally dragged himself from bed. Yawning lazily, he got out the cold cereal and sat down to eat. The whole while staring out at the log. If he carved a canoe, it wouldn't have to mean he planned to escape. Maybe he would use it for fishing, he told himself, but Cole knew that was a lie. He finished his dish of cold cereal, then walked out to the log. He picked up the hatchet and began swinging hard, shaping a bow. By each afternoon, the end of the driftwood log had been roughly formed into a flat point. Cole felt angrier each time he rested. His only satisfaction came from swatting horseflies and mosquitoes. Never again would those little bloodsuckers feed off him like a carcass. Overhead, a pair of eagles worked the shoreline looking for fish. Suddenly, one dove towards the water. It struck the surface with its talons and rose back into the air, carrying a large struggling fish. Cole watched, fingering the hatchet in his hands. This was the first day he had felt angry since Edwin and Garvey left. This was also the first day he had skipped going to the pond. He spit at the wind shavings. Spit at the wood shavings. He had just slept badly, he told himself. Again, Cole knew he was lying. He had slept poorly because he had considered making a canoe instead of a totem. Taking a deep breath, he lifted the hatchet and began striking the center of the log. Again and again he hacked until a deep groove circled the log. With each blow, he felt his anger disappearing. When the log could no longer be used as a canoe, Cole pulled out the knife Garvey had given him and began whittling and shaping the deep groove into an eagle's head. As he carved, he thought about the eagles he had seen and why they were such proud and powerful hunters. He continued carving until dark. After eating supper and cleaning up, Cole went out to the fire pit and built a fire. He waited patiently until the flames burned high, then began to dance the eagle dance. Around and around the fire he circled, his arms spread like wings, banking left and right. Tonight he soared on the thermals and the air currents, seeing things that only an eagle could see. After a long dance, Cole finally sat on a stump near the fire to catch his breath. His thoughts still moved high above the trees. He wished that somehow he could always stay part eagle in his mind. How could he remember to stay strong and proud, seeing everything in life differently from a distance? As Cole sat staring at the flames, it began to drizzle, and finally he got up and went inside the cabin. The dance had helped to ease the stiff pain in his hip and arm. When he fell asleep that night, he slept hard and dreamed of soaring high. The next morning Cole awoke early and went for a soak. Afterwards, as he carried the rock, he had to admit it felt good to return to the pond. He watched for the spirit bear, but saw nothing. Since returning to the island, he had caught only one fleeting glimpse. During Edwin's next visit, as they dragged the skiff up on the rocks, Cole asked, "Why have I only seen the spirit bear once since coming back? I've seen plenty of tracks, but last time I was here I saw it a bunch of times, especially after I got mauled." Edwin lifted a heavy box of supplies and headed towards the cabin. At first, it was probably the bear's curiosity, he said. "Maybe after being mauled, you were invincible." "What do you mean, invisible? What do you mean, invisible?" Edwin didn't answer the question. "Have you finished your schoolwork?" he asked. Cole nodded and handed Edwin his completed lessons. "Any mail?" Edwin folded the homework into his jacket pocket. "There's been mail, but we're not allowing you any contact with the outside world. I can tell you this. Garvey said your mom calls almost every day to ask how you're doing." Cole held back his emotions. "I think of her too. How's Dad?" Edwin shrugged. After he was arrested, his lawyers got him released the same day. He never spent a single night in jail. "Will I ever have to live with him again?" Cole asked. "I can't answer that question," Edwin said. "How's Peter?" "Not well. Garvey says his bouts of depression keep getting worse." "I wish I could help him somehow." Edwin turned and studied Cole. "I think you're getting closer to understanding the secret of healing." Entering camp, Edwin spotted the totem Cole was carving and walked over to see it. First he examined the tapered butt of the log, then the half-carved eagle. His voice turned hard. "It looks like you tried to carve a canoe." Starting down at the ground and speaking almost in a whisper, Cole said, "I started making a canoe, but I knew that was wrong, so I cut this deep groove so I couldn't try again. When I started carving the eagle, I finally slept good." Cole ended by telling about his eagle dance and what he had learned. "Are you mad at me?" he asked. "I'm proud that you carved a totem and were honest with me," Edwin said. Cole paused. You said I wouldn't heal all the way until I discovered one thing. Can you just tell me what that is? I don't feel like I'm healing at all." Edwin shook his head. "You'll discover what it is when you're ready to understand." "Then tell me this," Cole said. "What are totems for?" "They tell ancestry," Edwin explained, "and they tell stories. But how come they mostly have animals?" "Animals are symbols. Tlingit tribes have two divisions, the ravens and the wolves. Closely related members form smaller clans. I'm from the killer whale clan." "I'm not Indian," Cole said. "Does that mean I can't carve a totem?" Edwin chuckled. "Indians don't own the trees or the right to carve. Carve anything you want. Your totem is your story, your search, and your past. Everybody has their own. That's why you carve. That's why you dance the dances. That's why you live life, to discover and create your own story." Cole listened quietly, then spoke. I haven't created much of a story yet. I tried last week to dance the dance of anger, but I felt awkward, like I was pretending. You'll dance that dance when you're ready. When will that be? You'll know. Chapter 22. After Edwin left, Cole spent the rest of the afternoon carving. At one point, a downpour forced him to roll the log close to the cabin. He stretched a tarp out from the cabin wall so he could keep working. By nightfall, he had finished the eagle. Already, he had decided to carve a wolf next. The next morning, after visiting the pond, he washed his clothes in the stream. He built a fire in the cabin's barrel stove, then hung the clothes across the room on a makeshift clothesline. If he hung his clothes outside, they would never dry. That afternoon, he tried to make himself invisible. He bathed extra well in the cold stream, then put on clean clothes. He even rubbed ashes and sweet cedar boughs over himself to mask any human smell. Then he hiked out to a point at the mouth of the bay where he could watch the shoreline both outside and inside the bay. He wedged himself down between two big rocks and sat totally still. For 2 long hours he waited, but saw nothing. Frustrated, he got up and moved into the trees to try hiding beneath the thick undergrowth. The shore came gradually alive with seals, seagulls, and eagles, but no bears. Finally, chilled to the bone, he turned to camp. Several more times before Edwin's next visit, Cole tried being invisible, but had no luck. One morning, a beaver swam around him as he sat in the pond. At first, all he could see was a V-shaped ripple on the surface as the big animals swam closer and closer. Cole cleared his mind, breathed deeply, and sat completely still. The beaver swam even closer. Suddenly, Cole reached out and tried to grab it. The beaver exploded in the water, slapping its tail with a loud whack before disappearing. That was the only time the beaver ever came near. Cole regretted betraying the beaver's trust. He couldn't help but think how many thousands of times he had done the same thing to people. That night, he danced the beaver dance. He realized that a beaver had persistence, patience, and ingenuity. By using only its front teeth to chew down one tree at a time and dragging each one into the water, it eventually made a home that could dam a whole river. The next day, Cole began carving a beaver's head. He tried to think about the lessons the beaver had to teach, but he grew frustrated by how poorly he carved. His beaver head looked more like a deformed frog. Still, he kept carving. The air warmed with the passing of spring and the coming of summer. Some days not a cloud showed in the open blue sky, but most days were drizzly and wet. Cole had never seen a place with more rain. Back in Minneapolis, Cole had thought that being alone on an island would give plenty of time to just sit around. But just the opposite was true. Each day he kept busy cooking, carving, soaking in the pond, fishing, carrying the ancestor rock, washing clothes, doing schoolwork, and cutting firewood. Cole prided himself on how sharp he kept his knife and hatchet. Many nights he sat on his bed, working them against a flat stone until they could shave paper. Cole also continued to explore and look for the spirit bear, but still the bear did not show itself. Each night, Cole tried without luck to find the feelings to dance, the dance of anger. Weeks passed, but the large blank space he had reserved at the bottom of the totem for his anger carving remained empty. During one of Edwin's visits, Cole expressed his frustration. I've tried to be invisible, he said. I hide and try not to smell like a human. I've even smeared cedar boughs and ashes all over my body, but I still haven't seen the spirit bear again. Maybe you still aren't invisible, Edwin said, climbing into his skiff to leave. Have you danced the dance of anger yet? Cole shook his head. Edwin pulled the starter rope and brought the engine to life. He motioned for Cole to push him out from shore. Cole felt helpless as he watched the Tlingit elder disappear across the water. This time he had stayed barely long enough to unload supplies. Didn't he care? Was he mad? Cole returned to camp and spent the rest of the day carving. As he carved, two questions haunted him. What was the one thing that would help him heal? And how could he become invisible? Many days Cole still fought hard to escape his familiar rage. It kept reappearing for no reason. He could understand at these times he concentrated on funny and happy things. No matter how hard he tried, however, he still couldn't bring himself to dance the dance of anger. Long, frustrated hours beside the fire brought angry moments, but the dance refused to come to him. One day, after carrying his ancestor rock up the hill, Cole rolled his anger away, then sat down to think. Why had the spirit bear come to him when he lay wounded? Why had the beaver and fish come so close to him in the pond? He hadn't been invisible at those times. And why hadn't the bear showed himself again? Cole puzzled so hard his head hurt, but there seemed no connection. Nothing made sense. Finally, he headed back to camp and worked the rest of the day in sullen mood. That night, he went to bed as usual, but in the early morning hours, he awoke with a start and jolted upright in bed. He knew how to be invincible. Chapter 23. To be invisible, he had to clear his mind. That was the secret. Cole stared up into the darkness. In the cold pond, his mind became almost trance-like. The fish and the beaver had come close until he thought of hurting them. The day he touched the spirit bear, he had been near death and had completely given up trying to be in control. Being invisible had nothing to do with being seen. Being invisible meant not being sensed or felt. This discovery excited Cole and set him to thinking. If animals existed in a world of instincts and senses beyond the conscious thought of the mind, what happened to people in their frantic worlds of noise and hectic rushing? How much of the world did people miss because they were not calm enough, empty enough to experience? Cole's thoughts raced as he stared up at the black ceiling of the small cabin. He couldn't wait until morning. When dawn finally arrived, he hiked to the opening of the bay instead of going to the pond. He made no special preparation except to wear a heavy sweater and rain slacker. The persistent drizzle and cold had become a daily part of his life here on the island. As he walked, he focused on the patterns around him. The lapping waves came as regularly as deep breaths. The light drizzle roughed the water's surface. Clouds hung low as fog, and thousands of smooth, worn rocks lined the timeless shoreline like a ghost highway that disappeared into the mist. Cole felt a part of the patterns as he meandered along the shore. When he reached the point, he picked a natural saddle between two rocks and sat down. He focused his gaze on a small white rock near the water's edge and breathed in deeply. To see the spirit bear, he needed to clear his mind and become invisible, not to the world, but to himself. He left his hood down to let his head and senses remain exposed to the air. The cool drizzle soaked his hair, and soon droplets of water dripped off his forehead onto his cheeks. When he closed his eyes, the droplets felt warm on his face. At first, they felt like his own tears of anger and fear. Then he breathed more deeply, feeling the rhythm of the world around him, an endless rhythm where time disappeared. As the past, present, and future became one, the droplets on Cole's cheeks dripped to the ground, melting into the landscape to which they belonged. When he opened his eyes once again, it was as if he were walking from a deep sleep. Far down the shoreline, where the rocks disappeared into the folding mist, a white object had appeared. At the place where things visible faded into not being, there stood the spirit bear, as clear as if it were standing only feet away. The bear gazed patiently. As Cole stared back with the same patience, all time, even the present, ceased to exist. He no longer thought of himself as Cole Matthews, a juvenile delinquent from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Instead, he was part of the landscape, without a beginning or an end. Rain dripped off the rocks that lined the shore the same way it dripped from his forehead and flowed down across his cheeks and lips. It blurred his vision, and he blinked. The spirit bear disappeared. Because Cole and the bear belonged to the same landscape now, Cole still felt the bear inside. He closed his eyes, still remembering. When Cole next opened his eyes, he had no idea how much time had passed. He crawled stiffly to his feet and picked his way back along the shoreline towards camp. That night, Cole built a bigger than usual outdoor fire. He cooked his supper ceremoniously. With delicate pinches, he added spices to the boiling water. Then, carefully, he broke in spaghetti noodles. He heated sauce, stirred with deliberate strokes. When he ate, he savored every bite as if it were the last he would ever eat. When Cole finished eating, he washed dishes and carefully folded a towel which he had used as a tablecloth. Edwin had said that every day and every meal was to be savored, but tonight was extra special in Cole's mind. Today he had discovered how to be invisible, and now he was ready for the dance of anger. Carefully he stoked the fire once more and sat down to wait for both the flames and his feelings to come alive. When the fire blazed high, Cole stood. Suddenly, a frightening scream escaped his throat. As the sound melted away down the shoreline and into the trees, he began to dance. Spinning and weaving, he crossed the clearing to a solitary tree near their cabin. The tree was a tall cedar with only sparse scrub branches down low. Cole crouched before the solid trunk and doubled his fists menacingly. The tree defined him. That was why he had attacked the spirit bear. Its proud existence challenged him. "Get out of my way!" Cole ordered, swinging his fist as if to hit the tree. Again and again he warned the tree to move out of his way. When it remained, he lunged forward, swinging his fist within inches of the tree. "Get out of my way!" he shouted. "I'm warning you!" When still the tree didn't move, Cole grabbed at the lower branches of the all the while cursing and muttering angry threats. The branches broke. Cole continued his dance. He spun and lunged at imaginary enemies in the dark, yelling at the rocks and the sky and at the water, "Get away! Don't mess with me!" Already his dance had lasted longer than any of his dances in the past, but Cole was far from done. The whole world was challenging him, and the dance grew more violent. Cursing wildly, he turned back to the flames and gave the burning chunks of wood a hard kick. Flames and hot ashes exploded into the dark. He kicked again and again, and soon the camp was a bed of glowing embers. Cole stalked among the smoldering ashes, grunting with effort and rage. He pretended to throw his spear, then fell to the ground and clutched his hip and arm. He grimaced as he relived the bear attack and the hatred he had once felt for Spirit Bear. Twisting on the ground, he relived the pain, the cold, and the loneliness. He continued his dance on the ground. As he writhed slowly on his back near the coals, his heart pounded a steady beat like a distant drum. He felt the storm that had killed the sparrows. He saw again the jagged white flash of lightning and heard again the crash of the huge tree that almost ended his life. Still Cole continued. Standing, he walked to the shoreline and picked up a big rock. The rock became his ancestor rock as he walked in circles. Then, with an exaggerated motion, he heaved the rock into the water. When waves from the splash reached shore, he called into the darkness. "I'm sorry!" he screamed louder. "Please forgive me. I didn't mean to hurt you, Peter." The only answer Cole heard was the breeze pushing through the treetops. Tears came to Cole's eyes and flowed down his cheeks. For several minutes he let the tears flow, but he knew the dance must continue. Moving back to the fire, he spun among the dying embers on the ground with a graceful motion, gently kicking the larger coals back together. One by one he returned the scattered clumps to the fire pit, each piece becoming a part of his dance and a part of his healing. The mound of embers and charred wood glowed brighter until a single solitary flame licked up, followed soon by another. Cole hugged his arms tightly to his chest and kept dancing. By the time the fire burned brightly again, sweat beaded his forehead and rolled down his cheeks with his tears. He was powerless to stop crying. His tears continued as if from some huge bottomless lake. Now Cole had danced half the night, but still a defiant flicker of anger remained inside him. He wanted to throw up that anger, like bad food, and be rid of it forever. He turned to face the tree he had threatened earlier. Again he lunged towards the tree, only this time he let his fist strike the trunk. With each lunge he struck the tree harder, ignoring the pain. Fist swollen and bleeding, Cole stopped suddenly. He caught his breath, feeling an overwhelming shame. In the middle of the night he sank to his knees at the base of the tall cedar, his body shaking with sobs. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," he whispered. At that moment, words he had never been able to speak before welled up inside of him. "I forgive you," he cried loudly. "I forgive you." Then his energy totally spent, Cole collapsed to the ground. Now his dance was over. The glowing embers cast faint shadows into the surrounding night and under the trees. A large set of eyes reflected the light, staring patiently out of the darkness. Chapter 24. The next morning, Cole went to the totem to carve his angered dance. He stared at the blank space in the bottom of the pole. What figure or shape would express what he had learned during the dance? He knew one thing. Nobody ever woke up in the morning and chose to be angry. That meant that if he remained angry, something outside him controlled him. Cole didn't like the idea of being under the control of anybody or anything. So what could he carve to show he was sorry and that he had learned to forgive? What could he carve to show the healing that had taken place and the understanding he felt? Cole left the space untouched and returned to the cabin. "I danced the dance of anger," Cole announced during Edwin's next visit. Edwin glanced at him. "What did you learn?" "To forgive," Cole said. "Being angry is giving someone else control of my feelings so they own me. Forgiving gives me control again." "And what did you carve in the totem to show forgiveness?" "Nothing yet," Cole murmured. "There's still something missing. It isn't enough to be sorry and forgive. Somehow I have to figure out a way to help Peter. Until then, I'll never be able to carve anything in the blank space. That's what I had to discover before I could heal, wasn't it?" Edwin smiled slightly and nodded. "How to help Peter heal is something that will haunt you and stay in your thoughts like a sliver under your skin. The harm you did to him will fester and pain you all of your life unless you're able to make up for it." "And what if I can't help Peter?" Cole asked, worried. "Then you need to help someone else. Is that why you and Garvey have helped me so much?" Edwin nodded, then turned and walked towards the boat. Cole could tell he was struggling to contain his emotions. As the short North Country summer passed, Edwin's visits grew less frequent. When he did come to the island, he spoke little, as if something was bothering him. He stayed only long enough to unload supplies, pick up Cole's school assignments, and look at the totem. Each visit, the totem had a new carving, but Edwin always seemed to focus on the blank space at the bottom of the pole, although he made no comment. By the end of summer, Cole had carved a seal's head, a sparrow in a nest, and a raven. There were dozens of the huge black birds hanging out of the trees around camp, cawing for handouts at mealtime. Cole also carved a jagged bolt of lightning and a big raindrop after dancing a storm dance. By September, the salmon began working their way upstream to spawn. Each day during his soak, Cole watched them. He could see them leaping high out of the water, trying to make their way up through the gushing gorge of water above the pond. When the salmon run finished several weeks later, Cole danced their dance and carved their figure into the totem. During late summer and early fall, Cole had spotted the spirit bear every few days as it wandered along the shore outside the bay or drank from the stream near the pond. But gradually, as winter gained a grip on the island, the sightings ended and the fresh tracks disappeared. Cole knew that Spirit Bear had found a cave somewhere or dug out a hollow under a fallen tree to hibernate. Cole stubbornly kept visiting the pond for his morning soak, even though the water numbed him in minutes. Because of the bitter winds the winter brought, Cole spent more and more time holed up inside the warm cabin. Sometimes the wind blew so hard the draft through the cabin blew out his lanterns. He stuffed paper, cloth, moss, tinfoil, and anything else he could find into the cracks. Every 2 hours he got up during the night to stoke the fire. Nights when he failed to get up, he paid the price by having to start a new fire from scratch while he shivered in his underwear. Carving on the totem became almost impossible. The icy cold stiffened Cole's joints and made his fingers numb and awkward every time he cut himself prying his knife against the slippery wood. He also quit trying to collect firewood. Now whole weeks passed without any let-up of the rain. Everything became soggy, and Cole was glad he had cut and stacked a huge woodpile. The last thing Cole gave up was carrying the ancestor rock and soaking in the pond. Walking over the frosty rocks along the stream bed became too treacherous. Even when he hiked near the tree line, icy winds pierced his jacket and left him chilled. Winter's daily routine settled into splitting firewood, carrying water from the stream, cooking, reading, and doing schoolwork. Any fishing now was strictly for food, not sport. Cole kept track of time with an old calendar he found in the supplies. Each night before going to bed, he took a pencil and marked off the day. When he turned the page to a new month, he treated himself to a candy bar. Edwin never brought many candy bars with the supplies. Being confined allowed Cole more time for schoolwork, but also more time to think about being alone. Some nights he cried himself to sleep from loneliness. He couldn't help it. The silence became overpowering, and he longed to hear another human voice. He noticed his own voice became hoarse and higher pitched from lack of use. If only Edwin would visit more often. The Tlingit elder's quiet presence was better than the endless hours alone. During the long nights, Cole thought a lot about Garvey, about his mom, and about his dad. Had his father changed at all? And what about Peter? Cole still could not think of a way to help him. Edwin had said during his last visit that Peter was growing more bitter and depressed, hardly talking to anyone, even his parents. Without the daily soaks and carving the totem, Cole found it harder to end each day with his mind clear and still. Sometimes anger crept back. It was as if it waited for him to blow out the lantern each night. Then Cole felt a growing resentment that he was being forced to endure this lonely existence. At these times he imagined reaching up and touching the spirit bear, but he feared what would happen when he returned to Minneapolis and there was no ancestor rock, no soaking pond, and no totem. Would he still be able to find the spirit bear? With his activities strictly limited by winter's harsh winds and bitter cold, Cole noticed his body falling into new natural rhythms. He found himself moving out at a deliberate pace, without rushing. He slept when he was tired and ate only when he was hungry. Christmas came uneventfully. Cole hiked the shoreline a few days early and found a little scrubby pine tree, barely 3 feet tall, growing against the trunk of a larger tree. He figured the big tree would eventually destroy the deformed pine anyways. Cole chose it for his Christmas tree. He made tree ornaments out of aluminum foil. On Christmas Eve, Cole sat alone in front of his twisted little tree as the wind outside moaned through the treetops. Did anyone anywhere miss him at this moment? He went to bed early that night, not knowing the answer to that question. The next time Edwin visited, Cole said to him, "Christmas was really lonely. I felt like the whole world had forgotten about me." "Don't drown in self-pity," Edwin said. "You have more than most people. There's a whole box of your mom's letters waiting for you back in Drake. She knows you can't have mail, but she still writes every couple of days anyways. How's Peter doing?" "He's grown more depressed. He no longer wants to get out of bed, and they have him on heavy medication." After Edwin left, Cole couldn't stop thinking about Peter. He tried to ignore his thoughts by reading from a stack of books not part of his schoolwork. Getting lost in the stories helped him to forget, but only for a while. Some days he read all day and late into the night. By the end of February, Cole had finished the last book in the stack and asked Edwin for more. Another few months and it would be time to leave the island. Still, the space at the bottom of his totem remained empty. He had to figure out what to carve there before he left the island. At night, dreams of the empty space began taunting him. One day, near the end of March, Edwin stopped by for one of his visits. A cold, drenching rain had been falling all day. When Edwin stepped from the skiff, Cole could tell that something was wrong. Edwin mumbled a half-hearted greeting as he pulled his boat safely up the rocks. He silently picked up and carried a box of supplies towards the cabin. Cole picked up the other box from the skiff and followed. Inside the cabin, he heated water while they dried off. Edwin sat beside the window and waited until he was almost finished sipping a cup of hot chocolate before he turned to Cole. "I got a call from Garvey yesterday," he said. "How is Garvey?" Cole asked excitedly. "He said that last week Peter tried to commit suicide." "Suicide?" Cole caught his breath. "Why?" "Someone is treated as if his life is worthless, he begins to believe it." "But his life isn't worthless," Cole protested. Edwin stood and with one motion opened the door and flung the last of his hot chocolate outside. "I never told him he was worthless," Cole argued. Smashing his head on a sidewalk is a funny way of telling Peter he's vulnerable. That was a mistake, Cole pleaded. Edwin picked up his raincoat and headed into the pouring rain. Hell of a mistake, he called back, pulling on his coat as he strolled towards his boat. Wearing only a t-shirt, Cole ran after Edwin. I've said I'm sorry, he shouted. Edwin stopped in his tracks and turned so suddenly Cole nearly ran into him. That doesn't help Peter. He turned and continued towards his boat. What more can I do? Cole pleaded. Edwin kept walking, ignoring the rain and cold. I'm not sure anything can help now. When he crawled into the boat, he gave the starter rope a sharp pull, and the engine roared to life. There's no one way to help him, Cole blurted, but his voice was drowned out as Edwin revved the engine to steer the boat out away from the rocks. You're not listening, Cole screamed across the water. I can help him. Edwin gunned the engine and angled out of the bay, refusing to look back. As Cole watched the boat disappear into the rain, he picked up a strand of kelp off the shore and gave it a hard fling. Maybe Edwin was right, and nothing could help Peter. But maybe if Peter came to the island, he would see how much things could change. Peter was probably terrified. That was exactly why he needed this place. He could visit the pond. He could carry the ancestor rock and carve his own totem. He could dance and maybe even see the spirit bear himself. Most important, Cole could prove to Peter this island held no monsters. Long after Cole returned to the cabin and stoked the barrel stove, he kept thinking about Peter. How had Peter tried to commit suicide? And what if he had succeeded? Cole shuddered. If only Edwin hadn't left in such a hurry. Now it would probably be several more weeks before he came back with more supplies, but then it might be too late for Peter. Cole knew that the idea of Peter coming to the island was nothing more than a desperate thought. No parents in their right minds would ever allow their son to come here alone, and certainly not to stay with Cole. Not after what had happened. Even with someone like Edwin or Garvey around, Peter himself would never agree to come. Cole crawled into bed, but tossed fitfully. He remembered his own close brush with death, and how terrified he'd been. It haunted him to think that Peter had tried to end his life on purpose. How scared must someone be to actually go searching for death? Cole awoke well before sunrise. He dressed and went outside to go to the bathroom. The sky was unusually clear and filled with stars, and a warm breeze rustled the trees. Cole guessed that dawn was no more than an hour away. After returning inside, he stoked the fire, then pulled on his rubber boots and his rain slicker. It was months since he had last visited the pond. He knew the icy water would shock his skin like an electric fence, but it this morning needed desperately to calm his troubled thoughts. He had fallen asleep thinking of Peter, and he had awakened thinking of Peter. Cole picked his way carefully in the dark. Life on the island had become a peaceful and almost boring routine that he understood well. Till yesterday, anyway. Now Cole trudged along in a confused daze. Reaching the pond, he stripped in the darkness, then waded in without hesitation. The icy water stung his skin like fire. He tried to relax, but the cold quickly drove him to the shore. This water would kill him if he stayed in it long. There hadn't even been time to breathe deeply and clear his mind. By the time Cole got dressed and carried the ancestor rock, the sun had peaked above the trees. Then he heard an unexpected noise. The unmistakable buzz of Edwin's outboard engine floating over the trees. Cole took off at a dead run down the slope. What was Edwin doing back so soon? Cole scrambled and slipped along the edge of the stream towards camp. Dark shadows from the trees fell across his path and made the going treacherous. Several times he slipped on icy rocks and sprawled flat in a shallow water. Cole arrived in camp, breathing hard. He found Edwin inside the cabin, waiting calmly by the window. "What are you doing here?" Cole stammered, his teeth chattering. Water dripped from his wet clothes onto the bare plywood floor. "What did you do, go swimming with your clothes on?" Edwin asked. "I heard your engine, so I ran back from the pond. I slipped some. What are you doing here?" "Get some dry clothes on," Edwin said. While Cole changed, Edwin sat gazing out the window, his thoughts far beyond the bay and the island. Finally Cole sat down on the edge of the bed. "Why are you here?" he asked. Edwin picked at the rough edge of the table with his thick, chipped thumbnail. Peter tried again last night to commit suicide. His parents are desperate. Edwin placed both hands flat on the table. Yesterday when I left here, you said you could help Peter, and you hollered after me that I wasn't listening. Well, now I'm listening. Tell me what you meant.